Hey guys, Magnetico here, and welcome to my series of videos where we take video game systems, we clean them up, repair them if need be, and sometimes we mod them. And today we're going to be taking a look at a system that came out in the year 2000 and is still the undisputed best-selling system of all time at 155 million units sold. It's not hard for me to say that this is the system that I probably played the most amount of games on. It's easy for me to say that this is the system that I probably clocked the most amount of hours on, and it's really easy for me to say that this is my favorite system of all time. I'm of course talking about the PlayStation 2. There's something about the PlayStation 2 and it allowing you to tell great stories and adventures, and I'm not talking about the ones in the games, I'm talking about real life ones. For example, this PlayStation 2 is not my childhood PlayStation 2. I ended up selling that one, maybe using credit to buy a PlayStation 3 because the PlayStation 3 was backwards compatible. So I didn't need it, I do regret it, but you know, this is just the way it was back in the day. And I ended up buying this from the nicest woman I've ever met on Facebook Marketplace. I had to take a 50-minute to an hour drive, but she sold this in really rough shape for about $40, and I thought, hey, that's a great idea. Why don't we take its system that is in really rough shape, we can go ahead and make a video about it so we can clean it up and then go ahead and post it on YouTube. That leads me to my second adventure with this system, because I ended up cleaning this over a year ago and I ended up recording all the footage, and it was, I'll be honest with you, it was an absolute disaster. There were so many mistakes. The footage was pretty much unusable because I had to keep going back and fixing things, and I actually almost gave up making YouTube videos because of this very system that I'm holding in my hands right now. Even though it was a great idea, I was a lot more inexperienced when it came to disassembly systems and then putting them back together, and I was just not as patient. So all that footage was just unusable, and I got really frustrated, and I decided that I probably wasn't going to be doing this. However, I actually stopped recording it and I took my time with this system. So this particular system has been cleaned up by me in the past. I've replaced the thermal pads on this, and I did a thorough cleaning on it, and it took my time, and I actually learned a lot by doing that. But I was not prepared for the amount of ribbons and screws and certain things that you have to be very particular about, because if you put it back together and you missed a ribbon, you have to take pretty much the whole system apart in order to fix that particular mistake. And it's just something that I just gave up on. So I moved on to other systems. It is not just now that I built up the courage to say, hey, let's go ahead and do it. So this system has been cleaned. As I said before, the laser has been replaced because it wasn't able to read the blue PS2 disc, and it wasn't able to read PS1 disc. So we ended up fixing that as well, but that is no problem, because as usual, we're going to go ahead and open it up, clean it up, maybe fix any mistakes that I have in there, and then in future videos, we'll go ahead and mod it and do everything else that we normally do with these consoles. So thank you guys so much for joining me. Before I start the video, in the comments below, please let me know of any adventures that you've had with your PlayStation 2, because I would love to hear them. If this is your kind of thing where somebody goes through and cleans up systems, repairs them if need be, and sometimes mods them, make sure you hit that subscribe button. That way you're notified every time I post a video. Let's start the cleanup. The items you're going to need are going to be a PlayStation 2, some thermal pads, replacement batteries for the clock, some tools so you can open up the PlayStation 2, and I'll go ahead and link all these items in the description below. You're going to need some isopropyl alcohol, I use 99%, Q-tips, and a toothbrush. So with the PlayStation 2, we're going to go ahead and grab it and flip this guy over. And we're going to take this prying tool and we're going to remove the 4 rubber pads at the bottom of the PlayStation 2. I drop one there, but make sure you keep those somewhere safe. We're also going to remove 4 plastic caps that also reveal more screws. There should be 8 screws total. There should be 4 rubber pads and 4 plastic pads to take off from the bottom of the PlayStation 2. With all 8 screws revealed, we can go ahead and remove them all. 4 of the screws should be shorter and 4 of the screws should be a lot longer. And you just keep these somewhere safe. But once you take off the 8 screws, I'm going to go ahead and flip this guy over again. But with the back side, before I open up the lid, I'm going to remove the expansion bay door first. Keep that somewhere safe. If you have a sticker here, make sure you remove that and peel it gently. But once that sticker is removed, and removed all the screws, we can go ahead and lift up the lid. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and take out the power and a reset button, or reject button I should say. It's all three, but we're going to go ahead and take out that little ribbon and put this somewhere safe. Next, we're going to take the 2 back screws off and then the 2 front screws here for the controller port area. Once that's done, we can go ahead and kind of take off some of these pieces gently. We're going to go ahead and lift up the power. We're going to go ahead and lift up the fan. Once you take out the fan, the back plate should be pretty easy to remove. But be careful because the fan wires are very thin. But I'm going to put that somewhere safe for now. And this is one of the things about the PlayStation 2 that kind of bothers me, is that there's ribbons everywhere just kind of hanging when you're opening this guy up. So be very gentle. Watch out for the control port area, because that ribbon right there is just kind of hanging off. And that controller port actually is pretty heavy, so I'd be careful with that itself. So put the bottom plate or the bottom shell somewhere safe. And the worst is yet to come, because we have to take all these pieces that are just kind of dangling here, and we have to flip the PlayStation 2 completely over. So I tried to add as little tension as possible to the wires and the ribbons, so that way nothing comes off or nothing kind of breaks, if that makes sense. So once you have this guy flipped over, we can go ahead and continue with the rest of the disassembly. There are going to be 4 screws on the power supply board that we can take off here. With that, we can go ahead and lift the power supply, which should still be attached to the cable. We can go ahead and remove that cable if you want to, and put that somewhere safe. Next, we're going to remove the hard drive enclosure. And now we're going to remove this piece of plastic here, and make sure you put all of this somewhere safe. 9 screws hold the metal shielding of the PlayStation 2. It could differ depending on your version of the PlayStation. 2 of the screws are different, so make sure you remember where they went and put the screws somewhere separately. I'm going to take this prying tool so I can go ahead and remove the disk drive from the rest of the board here. There should be 1 large one in the front and 2 smaller latches in the back. Before I take off the metal shielding, I'm going to go ahead and remove the fan. And again, just be gentle, because the wire, especially in my version, is very thin, and I'm always worried that I'm going to break that particular wire. But now that that's done, we can remove the metal shielding from the PlayStation 2, revealing the board. Looks like my controller port ribbon fell off, so while we're at it, we're going to go ahead and remove the rest of these ribbons from the board. Lots of ribbons on the PlayStation 2. One of my least favorite things about disassembling this system. Here's the power button and eject button. And I'm gonna flip this board gently away from me. Well, depending on the orientation that you have the PlayStation at, but I'm gonna go ahead and remove this ribbon from the board to the disk drive. Now we can put the disk drive somewhere safe. So here is the PlayStation 2 board. It's super interesting to see, because this is one of the launch models here, and I'm kind of messing with the thermal pads there. They're incredibly hard, so they probably are going to need some replacing. This heatsink here, we're going to go ahead and pry gently from the rest of the board here. This blue thermal pad is work I did a year ago when I was working on the PlayStation 2. There is no harm in grabbing these versions. I am going to replace this thermal pad with a more efficient one, but these are 6 watts per meter Kelvin, which is probably exactly the same version what the PlayStation 2 originally used out of the factory. We'll talk about that more a little bit later, but here is the motherboard looking nice and clean, but we are going to clean it one more time. Before we continue, we're going to go ahead and remove this screw here. And this holds the memory card doors together. So let's remove this piece of plastic that's holding the structure together. With that out of the way, we can go ahead and remove the memory card doors. And these are identical. You can put them in any orientation, left or right. It doesn't matter. Luckily, they're exactly the same out of the factory, so no worries there. So you can go ahead and put these to the side so we can clean them. And now we're going to take all the pieces of plastic that we've collected throughout this assembly, so we can go ahead and clean them in some warm and soapy water as we have before with the other systems. I typically use the sink whenever I am cleaning up the systems, and I'll add some warm soapy water, and I'll grab some of that soapy water inside of a bowl so I can throw in the smaller pieces, and that way those pieces start soaking up and it's easier to remove all the dust and grime that have built up over the years. So I'll go ahead and put that aside for now. And then next I'll grab the larger pieces and I'll put them inside of the soapy water. So while I'm doing that, I'm going to give you guys a warning that the PlayStation 2 does come with a dust mesh that is in the bottom portion of the shell that you should be careful with. I wouldn't scrub on that too hard. It is held together by a small layer of adhesive. So it is cool if you go ahead and soak it, but I would not scrub it too much, otherwise it might fall out. You might have to either tape it together or find some kind of adhesive to put it back on. So I'd be careful with that. That's the only warning. While those pieces of plastic are drying after we have cleaned them, we're going to start working on the motherboard here with some isopropyl alcohol and a toothbrush, and just make sure you do a very thorough cleaning with the toothbrush, even with some Q-tips as well. Of course, this video is sped up, but I want to let you guys know that you should definitely take your time and do a nice clean on everything. I'll use the Q-tip when it comes to these particular chips here. And remember to take your time on these. Some of these might have some gunk left over from the older thermal pad that was on these. Again, I know this video is sped up, but take your time. Make sure that this thing is nice and clean. That way you don't have to open it probably ever again. So with that said, I'm going to start working on the controller port here. This one was actually pretty dusty. One of the worst parts about the PlayStation 2. There's just so much gunk that gets caught inside of the crevices of that. But next we're going to work on the power supply, and make sure you take your time on that one as well. Next, I'm going to go ahead and clean up the power and eject button for the PlayStation 2. I wouldn't recommend cleaning the ribbons. I usually just stick to the plastic when it comes to this. And then finally, I'm going to go ahead and clean up the disk drive. If you guys have disk drive issues, like maybe the laser's not reading disks anymore, let me know if you guys want me to do a disk disassembly as well. Here's the fan, looking very clean, but I remember messing with this fan earlier and it was actually one of the dirtiest parts of the system. So please make sure you use the toothbrush, a Q-tip, isopropyl alcohol, and just go through every blade if possible. Just be gentle with it. You don't want to break one of those blades. So here's the motherboard, nice and clean. We're going to take this prying tool here and we're going to remove this battery from the motherboard and replace it with a new one. What this does is it does actually save the time and the date on the PlayStation 2. Before we put a fresh battery in the PlayStation 2, I am going to clean the enclosure with a Q-tip and some isopropyl alcohol. Once that's clean, we're able to put a fresh new battery so this system can save the time and date for many years to come. Once that's done, we can go ahead and grab the board and flip it over, and we're going to focus on these 4 thermal pads that are pretty old. I already tried removing most of these. As you can see, they're all broken into pieces. Once you remove them, just be very gentle, clean up the chips that they were on, and I'm going to take this 3mm thermal pad and try to save one of the old thermal pads so I can measure them out. I did mention earlier that there's a difference between the blue thermal pads and the gray ones, where the blue ones have 6 watts per meter Kelvin. These are actually 13 watts per meter Kelvin. And the big difference is not only are they more efficient, they're also more malleable, so they're more of a putty. So these lines that we drew here, even though they're straight, we don't have to cut them absolutely perfect, because once we put them on the chip, we can kind of mold them and kind of smush it together. Now this is great when it comes to these smaller pieces, but it's a lot harder to work with when it comes to the bigger thermal cuts that we're going to make, especially when we start working on the chip one, which I'll show you here in just a second. So here's the motherboard, and we're going to put all 4 pieces that we just cut up on all 4 that we just removed. Remember to make sure these are clean. I know it was a pain in the butt. I actually had to use one of the prying tools to remove some of these older thermal pads that were there. Here I'm using the previous thermal pad from the PlayStation 2 to trace up a new one, and the size of this particular pad is 1.5 millimeters. Once you're done tracing, you can cut it up and place it on the heatsink. So before we continue on with the video, I want to let you guys know that a user by the name of the Real Winter Pillow let me know that I put on the thermal pad completely wrong. So at first I was like, no, there's no way. But he was like, no, really, take a look at this. So after reviewing the video, I want to first of all thank you very much for letting me know that I put the thermal pad completely wrong, and I will go ahead and fix it now in this part of the video. I will let you know how I did it wrong, but I'm definitely going to show you how I did it right. And all I had to do, instead of placing the thermal pad on the actual heatsink the way I wanted to do it, it was a lot easier just to place it on the chips. That way I got the orientation right. So again, thank you so much. Let's continue on with the video. With a little bit of luck, you won't have to remove this heatsink for a long time. The battery should last a long time. That thermal putty should last a very long time as well. So once you place the heatsink, let's go ahead and flip the system over. Now there is a ribbon that fell off during the disassembly process, and I'm going to go ahead and put that back together. It goes into the DVD drive, so if yours fell off during the process, that's completely normal. Just make sure you put this ribbon back on, otherwise it'd be very difficult during the reassembly. Now the reassembly of the system is, I believe, a little bit harder than the disassembly, just because there's a lot of moving parts and you got to make sure you get everything put back together. Otherwise, if you miss something, you have to basically take most of it apart, and it is a pain in the butt. So here I'm going to show you step by step how to make that happen. And as you can see, the thermal pads, I was able to shape them perfectly fine, and they're a perfect thickness to replace the old ones that were there that were rock hard. So when we put the DVD drive under the system, we can go ahead and plug in all the ribbons, including the one that we just placed back into the disk drive. Now it is hard to balance. Again, it is work to put this guy back together, but I'm going to use the controller ports to balance it, and then I'm going to put the ribbon into place. Now, unfortunately, that ribbon for the controller port I will need to place into the motherboard before we put everything back together. So I'm going to use the hard drive enclosure to balance it out. And I'm going to go ahead and grab the controller port ribbon and put it into the motherboard and lock it in. If I remember correctly, this is actually where I gave up making the original PlayStation 2 video, because I forgot to do something and I had to take this system apart several times, and I just gave up on it. But now we're older, more experienced, and a lot more stubborn. So let's go ahead and grab the metal shielding and place it on top of the system. As I'm wiggling the metal shielding into place, I am going to hit the corners first, so that way it snaps into place. And remember that this metal shielding actually does snap into the DVD drive as well, so make sure you do that. It'll actually leave the board nice and leveled, and you no longer need the hard drive enclosure to balance the rest of this. So once the metal shielding is in place, we can go ahead and take this out of the way, and as you can see, we're good to go. Remember that there were two screws that were different when it comes to this aspect of the disassembly, and those are the two golden screws that I just placed there first. The rest of them are silver. So it should be 2 golden screws and then 7 silver ones. Next, we're going to grab our clean fan and plug it back into the motherboard. Again, be careful with the wires because they're extremely thin. Once you plug it into place, and make sure you place the wire under the piece of tape that was originally on the PlayStation 2. I have replaced that piece of tape with this piece of Kapton tape, and I might have to replace it because it's not sticking very well at this point, but for now, it'll do the job. I'll replace it during one of the modding videos. We're going to take this piece of plastic and make sure it's oriented correctly into this particular area where it should go. You do have to snap it into place, especially on that top left corner. And once it's all the way down, we can grab our hard drive enclosure and place it into place as well. Lastly, we're going to grab this power supply and make sure we plug the wire first before we put it into place. Once we plug in the wire, we're going to look for these 4 holes, as you can see here, and that should be oriented with those metal pins. So flip the power supply over, align those holes with the metal pins correctly, and then go ahead and push it all the way down. Once it's all the way down and in place, we can go ahead and screw the power supply back into place. I would say the worst part about rebuilding the system is pretty much over. The only unfortunate thing that could happen at this point is if the controller port ribbon disconnected, and if it does, you would have to take most of the system apart. So what I like to do before I flip the system over is to make sure I put all the pieces, all the dangling pieces on top, and then grab them, make sure there's no tension, and then flip the system over. I'm going to grab the bottom shell here, and with the system flip, and again, and no tension on those dangling parts, I'm going to place the motherboard and these other parts into the bottom shell. There's not much pushing down that you have to do when it comes to this. You might have to wiggle it around just a little bit so everything just drops into place. The first thing I'm going to work on is this controller port. I'm going to feed the ribbon under the motherboard and then put the controller port in place. There were 2 screws that held the controller port together, so I'm going to go ahead and grab those and put it into place. So luckily, the controller port did not fall out, or the ribbon didn't snap out of the motherboard during this process. I am very thankful for that. I'm going to go ahead and spin this system around so the backside is now facing us. And I'm going to grab this fan and just put it gently on my pad here. And this particular fan, it does have an orientation. It does have a way that it has to not just sit, but also which way the air has to blow. And I will use these arrows as reference. You want the hot air blowing out of the system. So that is how the fan will be seated. I'm going to grab the back plate that holds the power switch and the fan and put the fan into place. It should be spinning to the left and it should be blowing the hot air out. Next, I'll put the power switch into the back plate. And now that that's done, we can go ahead and flip this system over once again. There are 2 screws that go in the back here. One of them holds the fan into place and the other one holds the power switch into place. And we're almost done with this process, ladies and gentlemen. We just have to work on the top shell next. So let's move this out of the way. And we're going to place the top shell down in this orientation. We're going to grab the memory card doors, and if your springs fell off, this is how they go. They're both identical. Again, you can put this door on the left side or the right side, it does not matter. And I'm going to go ahead and put these memory card doors into place. The spring leg should be kind of touching the top of the shell when you're putting this together. Actually, that spring leg does go into a little crevice, and that way it doesn't, fling all over the place. It just stays in place and it allows the doors to open and close every time you put in a memory card without issue. Now that we put the doors together, we can put this structure back into place to hold everything together. And there was 1 screw that held this together, so make sure you screw that in there. At this point, the top shell of the system is pretty much complete. I'm going to give the memory card doors a little bit of a test just to make sure that they spring back into place. So this one looks good and that one looks good. Perfect. So I'm going to grab the bottom shell of the system that we were working on earlier and the top shell, and we have to fit this power and eject button structure into the top shell. So it should go just like this. The buttons fit in pretty easily, but the plastic structure surrounding the power and eject buttons do have to go on the top of the shell in a certain way. Once you hear the snap, you know that you're good to go. Now that the power and eject button are back into place, we can go ahead and grab the top shell and flip it over the system carefully because there is a ribbon attached. Originally, there was a piece of tape that held the ribbon and the disk drive together like this, but I've replaced it with some Kapton tape. And to put the shell back into place, I typically go for the disk drive first, kind of tilt it towards you, put the disk drive in, and once that's in there, you can put the back of the shell down. And it should fit perfectly. So now we can go ahead and flip this system over so we can go ahead and button it up and finish up the assembly of the system. Remember, there were 8 screws. 4 of them were a lot longer, which are the ones you're going to see on the right side, and then there were 4 shorter ones as well that go on the left side of this orientation that we have here on screen. I'm going to go ahead and attach the 4 rubber pads that were on the system originally that cover up the screws, and to cover up the rest of the screws, remember there were 4 plastic tabs that came with the system as well, so we're going to go ahead and add those right after the rubber pads we just put in. So now that we have all the screws covered up and hidden, we can go ahead and flip this system over so we can do one more thing before we're finally done, and that is to add the expansion bay door back into the system. And this system is looking super clean, super tidy. I'm really happy with the way this turned out. So we're going to give it one last wipe before we go ahead and move on and test it out. Good PlayStation 2. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, our PlayStation 2 is finally completely clean. After putting this video off for a year, we have finally finished it. It is completely clean. We cleaned all the plastic, we cleaned all the components, we replaced the battery, and we also replaced all the thermal pads. And there are people out there that actually advise not to replace the thermal pads and just to leave the PlayStation 2 as is, which I respectfully disagree, especially when those thermal pads are over 20 years old and some of them get so hard that you can literally throw it at somebody and injure them if you were inclined to do that. If you guys have any questions, please let me know. But this particular PlayStation 2, it is now ready for many more years of service. So again, let me know in the comments below if you guys have any questions, or if you guys want to talk about your PlayStation 2 adventures. I would love to hear them. If this is your kind of thing where somebody goes through and cleans up systems, repairs them if need be, and sometimes mods them, make sure you hit that subscribe button. That way you're notified every time I post a video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.